Without saying too much, we can say simply that political systems arise when societies reach a certain critical mass of people, at which point they can no longer be regulated by kinship ties. What the magnitude of this mass is will no doubt depend on the situation, what the cultural and religious beliefs of said folk are, and whether or not they have neighboring states with already centralized regimes that they have to compete with. Needless to say, even reaching this mass of people will probably require agriculture, which will oft cause people to become less mobile geographically, now becoming somewhat dependent on their permanent shelter, less knowledgeable of the arts required to survive in the wilderness, and to some small extent, even in this early stage, more dependent on their communities due to some division of labor, all of which make them more susceptible to having their property appropriated by force. Perhaps if you are a bloody tinker bastard, then you can get away with a bit more. Once the population has reached this critical mass, however, historical circumstance in almost all cases, given sufficient time, indicates all factions which can bring to bear force will compete until only one remains with a monopoly on violence over a geographical region or a settlement, town or city and its neighboring lands. This occurs since having a division of sovereignty will in due time lead to some conflict of interest between factions, and since they both have independent armies or gangs, the resulting contest of violence will continue until it transpires that only one of the two factions remains, or one faction has been made completely subordinate to the other. Historically, the faction which remains standing leads. It controls the monopoly on violence and possesses a monarchical or oligarchical political structure. The society would then develop what the Italian school thinker Gaetano Mosca describes as a political formula, a system of beliefs that justifies the regime's power, making it so that those actions that result in a secure regime are agreeable to its subjects. Quite often even the elites believe in this political formula. Sometimes the formula is explicitly theistic, but in all cases it is mystical. Such a formula must be already appealing to the populace that it seeks to indoctrinate, and will often come in the form of a pre-existing tradition with necessary modifications. Plato conceded that even his Callipolis, ruled over by philosopher kings, would ultimately have to rest upon a noble lie. Of course, needless to say, we have no noble lies today. But if you are an activist spreading the objective truth of human rights and the least bad political system of democracy to every inch of the globe, with fundamentalist zealotry, well, my friend, you might just get yourself a Nobel Prize. When a society gives up on a political formula, that will most likely result in a regime change and a new host of elites. When the population grows, the monarch or group of oligarchs can no longer administer justice on his/their own. Thus he delegates his authority to resolve disputes between subjects to judges. The law develops in order to maintain fairness by imposing consistency to the rulings of said judges. Subjects ultimately respect these rulings because of the political formula, and if they defy the formula, then force is wielded and they are made to submit. Since the sovereign is the origin, institutor and enforcer of the law, they necessarily have authority to overrule decisions by other judges and decide on exceptional cases that do not fit neatly into the body of laws, as was their original function to preside as judge of disputes. They can also suspend the law and declare a general state of exception, but this ought to be restricted to the period of time necessary to establish a new body of laws. If it persists, the uncertainty will degrade at first commerce, due to the uncertainty of contracts, and eventually the general order of society. The wise sovereign, of course, once peace and order are established, will institute a body of law most conducive to the flourishing of the realm. Far from assimilating the population into a great automaton, he will create a system whereby the talents of his people can be most fully cultivated and expressed, and so the law, for a virtuous and responsible population, will not extend beyond that which is required to maintain order, that order which is necessary for true freedom. Given a more undisciplined or decadent population, less liberty may be permitted in order that more be permitted later. Sovereignty is conserved. Curtis Yarvin. No matter how you restructure your political system, you never eliminate the sovereign authority, though you may divide it, which causes the deleterious and contradictory use of power. Ultimately, some group of individuals or some institution or set of institutions wields the sovereign authority in each particular instance in which power is used, and the populace generally accepts the result so long as it is seen to be justified by the society's political formula. This division of power allows one party to gain more power by taking actions that are detrimental to the society at large, i.e. corruption. This can take the simple form of a bribe, whereby the party which holds sovereignty over a specific sector of the economy sets up an unequal regulatory environment, or worse, allows the outright formation of a monopoly in exchange for the bribe. In a system of divided sovereignty, an oligarch may take short-term actions that favor his own family but sacrifice the future of the state because his children will not inherit the whole state. In other words, he embezzles funds. If another is responsible for the currency and the mint, then he may debase the currency for personal gain, to the extent he is able to do so without being discovered. In other cases, It can take the form of creating a power base by exploiting differences in values between various ethnic elements within a society, using this as a way to appropriate property and gain a band of armed thugs. From a purely selfish point of view, the logic of using these armed thugs, or even just the threat of them, to appropriate further wealth and power will make sense until the general level of disorder created by this civil conflict causes more damage to your existing assets than the assets that you are able to acquire are worth. Still further, systems where the population's ideas matter, experts have powerful incentives to distort facts or indeed entire narratives, to make up bogus theories, simply in order to advance their careers. This is too often the real blight of our system, and of the various types of possible corruption. Though it is the most present and most important in our society, it is the least well understood. For the monarch, there is no incentive to take a bribe because all are subordinate to him. By taking a bribe he merely shuffles wealth around, all is in principle his. If he wants more he can simply raise taxes or outright expropriate it. As Yarvin has previously discussed, in reality people possess secondary, not primary property rights. Primary property rights are reserved for those with the force necessary to deter others from obtaining the property. In practice, secondary property rights basically function as primary property rights because it is the incentive of the monarch to fully delegate the authority over that property to you. Indeed, for the same reason, there is no reason to debase your own currency because you own the currency. By the same token, the monarch who has a proper grip has no incentive to favor any individual or ethnic group's interests in society over another, since there is nothing they can give him. He may have a particular favorite group, and he may choose to act on the basis of prejudices, but those prejudices arise from some cause other than his incentives as a political ruler. If the populace shares the political formula and he is secure in undivided sovereignty, then he has nothing to gain from pitting one group against the other. Finally, when it comes to the pollution of information, again, for a securely positioned monarch there is no incentive to pollute information to gain power. You already have power, and contrariwise you have every incentive not to pay a class of individuals whose job is literally to make propaganda about how useful their own job is. Therefore, as soon as there were doubts about whether there was any use in their ideas, or whether their empirical findings were repeatable, they would be tossed to the curb like the disgusting blood-sucking parasites that they are. So the monarch has no direct incentive, in this case, to deceive the population either. All of these statements begin to fall apart when the monarch's sovereignty is insecure or in doubt, however, that is when the system is at the borders of oligarchy. In such cases, it may indeed be advantageous for the monarch to be bribed because he cannot truly expropriate property at will, for the monarch to use a certain ethnic group in order to crush a political rival, for the monarch to debase the currency to raise funds to secure his regime, or the monarch to use propaganda to delegitimize his political rivals. Although all of this is ultimately for the best, because in resecuring sovereign authority into a single locus the monarch prevents all these types of corruption which are necessarily always present, if in milder forms, in oligarchical regimes, but even in their milder quality the effect they have on the social cohesion, discipline and tradition of a society over the course of 50 years may be irreparable. Another case where the above statements break down is if the political formula of a monarchy is based upon what the deep right calls demotist ideology, that is, basing the justification for its power on a notion of popular sovereignty or general will. This was the case with, obviously, Nazism and communism, both of which fall into this category. The consequence of justifying your sovereignty in this way is that you have to commit actions that are agreeable to whatever population your demotist ideology appeals to. It also depends on how much baggage there is from an ideological point of view. If it is a purely symbolic or sentimental gesture, like Napoleon labeling himself Emperor of the French instead of Emperor of France, then it is not likely to have a dramatic effect, at least in the short term, though repeated small concessions like this will eventually have the monarch turned into a vestigial organ. Napoleon had not reached the position of emperor as an ideologue or through politics, but rather through his excellent generalship, and the people were happy to call him emperor because he was not just competent, but supremely competent, so that he cast a shadow even upon the Sun King. That being said, when your demotist political formula is based on the notion of the moral superiority of a particular population, and the ideology behind the formula carries with it both a mystical ontological framework and a great pile of mandatory policies that have no basis in any human tradition, empirical evidence or historical experience, then the regime using said formula can always turn to useful scapegoats when it inevitably begins to falter. In the case of communism, there are obvious reasons arising from the political formula that translated to the gulags. It was the rich, the reactionary, the traditional, the Catholic, and then the Orthodox. Of course, there was a general leftist penchant for canceling anybody that was not pure enough too. But obviously the victims here are no coincidence. They are not the random outburst of violence by a monarchy committing indiscriminate slaughter because that is just what monarchies do or some shit. These murders were motivated by the political formula that appealed to the liberation of the working class as its ultimate goal. This causes power to be divided and radicalism necessarily encouraged, since anyone can accuse the leader of not serving the revolution, which of course will destabilize the proletarian dictator. So the proletarian dictator must become a tyrant and the object of a cult of personality to ensure the notion that anybody else ought to be the leader is always smothered before it escapes its cradle. The case of Nazism is a counterexample to the idea that only democracies can have efficient markets. The economy under the Nazis dramatically improved. That being said, unlike others, I do not think this had to do with Keynesian policies, though I would concede some state policies probably helped. The political formula for the Nazis was to be the notion of the state bringing about the Volksgemeinschaft, so Hitler's extreme passion and fire were necessary attributes. He too needed a cult of personality to justify his place over other Germans as the rightful helmsman to sail the country toward this Volksgemeinschaft. Credit must also be given to the Germans in World War II, who completely trounced every single democracy they fought. It was not until they had to fight the British Empire, the US and Russia, in the European theater alone that they lost. In general, demodist monarchies appear to perform worse than classical monarchies, but they still frequently show a degree of competence which is striking, as China, which is a demodist regime, specifically a Han ethno-state, has done during the coronavirus pandemic, making all Western governments appear completely fucking braindead by comparison. Is it not true that the historical democracies, England, Canada, Australia, and the United States, have performed better than their non-democratic counterparts? Well, for one, none of those countries are democracies, but also no, it's not true. There are two common errors here. One is to conflate liberal democracy and economic success, which China shows us evidently need not be coincident. So you say to yourself, maybe liberal democracy is a better system for innovation because liberalism encourages freedom of thought. This is the second most common mistake, conflating liberal democracy and technological progress. I'm calling to mind early 20th century physicists, mathematicians, chemists and engineers. And yeah, that is awkward. It is a list dominated by names from the continental monarchies. Indeed, the German Empire is a counterexample to the economic claim as well as the intellectual claim. It was probably the most advanced society in terms of technology and science in its time. The legacy of the empire's prowess in science and engineering in this period would carry over to German engineering excellence in World War II on both sides of the conflict, and later via Operation Paperclip find its way over to the West, and NASA would be founded as a result. At the beginning of World War I, the German Empire was a larger economy than the UK. It was behind in GDP per capita but was rapidly catching up. In terms of sheer competence, it certainly outstripped the other governments of the time period. It took on the two largest historical world superpowers, Britain and France, while also fighting Russia. And at the end of the war, the Central Powers suffered only 2/3 number of military deaths. The total population of the Central Powers was 1/6 that of the Allies, and the Allies took 4 years to beat them.
I certainly see no evidence monarchy produces less advanced societies, or as Pinker would claim, necessarily start wars.
So long as we avoid a demodist monarchy, we can avoid Hitler, Stalin or Mao. That is not to say, however, that we will necessarily never get ourselves an occasional Nero, Caligula or some such business. If all parties seek to maximize their wealth and power, WP, then each party in a system with divided sovereignty will take actions that increase their own WP but decrease the WP of the system as a whole, making the society weaker. If there is only one party, a monarch, the maximization of the WP of the monarch corresponds to the increase of the WP of the whole society, allowing one to pursue the global maxima of WP. If these claims are correct, then I spent the preceding paragraphs convincing you of something that many people will admit outright, which is that yes, monarchy is a more effective and stable method of political organization, but the problem is if you get a person in charge who is a megalomaniac or a monster such as X dictator or Y dictator, so the line goes, then you will get a horrifying dystopian regime. This is true, but I hope now that we have addressed that this often arises from the pathologies of monarchies using demodist political formulas, or in other words, monarchies justifying themselves on democratic grounds. Thus for now I rest my case until I publish the next post, where I will discuss how decentralized consensus has changed all of this and how it can remove the one fault of monarchy: bad monarchs. Bye. Democratic power does exist in society, but it has a fleeting nature, and lacking discipline almost always amounts to nothing. The peasants will riot, but soon enough they will return home. Just hold out until then and nothing need change. The nature of the sovereign authority is such that because it enforces the laws it must be above or outside the law. Anything else is contradictory. There is no meaningful sense in which a democratic regime can be discussed. In practice, popular sovereignty consists of blips when the force wielded by the hands of the mob is temporarily stronger than what the sovereign can exert, but this cannot be true always. The mob is an emergent property, an egregore that exists at this moment in time, a strange agenic beast that will commit all kinds of horrors and cause all kinds of chaos. What if such an egregore were to become sovereign? Then the egregore would be enforcing a system of laws upon its own constituent elements. Fantastical. More than just that, though, when the people are a part of it, they are in some sense stripped down and reduced, losing their agency and becoming just one more cog in the machine. A machine that cannot formulate what it wants 2 days from now, let alone 2 years. All it knows is that it's angry. In our society, infrequently do we get to see something so exciting. Almost all protests which we see are of such a form that they reinforce the political formula and are thus not at all sovereign or independent. Originally published at koshi.substack.com on August 13, 2022.